There was also a reddish-brown stain on the floor. 13-year-old Jeremy told her that he and Brad had been playing cops and robbers with his stepfather's guns. Not knowing that the guns were loaded, Jeremy said that Brad pulled the trigger, firing a round into the wall. The stain on the floor, he said, was ketchup. Jeremy told Jennifer that after the gun went off, Brad rushed out of the house, afraid that he would get into trouble. He didn't know where Brad went, and he hadn't heard from him since. Jennifer hadn't heard from him either. Investigators arranged to interview Jeremy Bach and his stepfather. Jeremy told the same story he had relayed to his friend, Jennifer. But when pressed on specific details, Detective Sally Dillian sensed that he wasn't telling the entire truth.
There were parts of it that we had a notion were probably going to be true, and other parts that you could tell weren't. Times when he would make the eye contact and other times when he wouldn't.
As investigators struggled to figure out what Jeremy was hiding, word came in that another classmate wanted to speak with police. In the principal's office at the nearby junior high school, police questioned one of the missing boy's friends. He believed that Jeremy Bach had done something to Brad Hansen. It was well known around school that Brad and Jennifer were boyfriend and girlfriend. And it was also known that Jeremy was extremely jealous. He also liked Jennifer. And though he and Brad were friends, Jeremy tried to break up the young couple's relationship. According to the classmate, Jeremy had been bragging that he was going to hurt Brad. Investigators feared Jeremy Bach had made good on his threat. But to prove that a crime had been committed, they needed to locate the victim's body. To do that, they struggled to put themselves inside the mind of a 13-year-old killer. One who didn't have access to a car.
We really had nothing, so we tried to figure out what we could do, and the only thing that we came up with was trash.
Detectives formulated a plan. Once a dumpster is put out on the curb, it is considered public property in the eyes of the law. 2 weeks after Brad Hansen was reported missing, police returned to the bomb threat. After the trash was put on the curb, investigators confiscated the can and then replaced it with another one. Once the trash can was secured in an evidence property room, Detective Dillian contacted forensic examiners at the Phoenix Police Department's crime lab. As soon as the lid was open, investigators knew their instincts had been dead on. Large stains and dried liquid pooled in the bottom tested positive for human blood. And forensic scientist Kevin Knapp didn't believe anyone could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention.
The dumpster was probably about 2 feet in diameter, and there was probably about an inch deep pool of blood, dried blood, in the bottom of the dumpster. So even without being a medical examiner, in my opinion, it was an awful lot of blood, more than I typically see in a case.
Now, examiners needed to verify that the blood found inside the trash can had originated from 13-year-old Brad Hansen. But there were no DNA samples from Brad to use for comparisons. Knapp had another option to get the evidence he needed.
We all get our DNA from our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. So you can look at a DNA profile from an offspring and determine whether or not the DNA pattern from the parents could have formed that child.
When the DNA samples collected from the trash can were compared to the genetic profiles of Brad's parents, the examiners found a match. Detectives confronted the 13-year-old suspect with their findings. Now, Jeremy Bach claimed that while playing cops and robbers, his hand accidentally hit the cover and the gun he was holding discharged. Sending Brad Hansen flying backwards into the wall. He didn't realize that his finger was on the trigger. Panicked, he cleaned up the blood and disposed of the body. For investigators, Jeremy's story stretched credibility.
He had said that when Brad was hit by the bullet, that he flew back and he hit the wall. Well, very seldom does someone fly back. That's movies. Okay, that's theatrics. Normally when somebody gets shot by a bullet, they drop.
Do you feel it as I do,
So
Guardian?
there were things that he was recounting to us that we did not feel were totally accurate.
And potent as sunshine. Soaking
Detectives
through your
returned to the
skin.
Bach residence with a search warrant.
Ashla knows what the Guardians have done. She watched as her lineage fell, one after the other.
They collected the 2 handguns that Jeremy's stepfather kept in the house,
Oryx
including the .357 Magnum revolver used in the shooting.
is eager to return that pain.
And though investigators found traces of Brad Hansen's blood in the kitchen, the findings did little to refute Jeremy's claim that the shooting was accidental. As long as investigators were unable to locate the victim's body, proving murder would be difficult. Blood evidence convinced Phoenix police that missing 13-year-old Brad Hansen was dead. Though they had been unable to locate his body, his classmate, Jeremy Bach, claimed that he accidentally shot the boy while they played cops and robbers. In a panic, he said he disposed of Brad's body in the trash. But investigators suspected that Brad Hansen had been murdered out of jealousy. Now they needed to prove it. Police turned to forensic examiners for help. At the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, firearms expert Mahesh Patel looked for evidence that could prove whether or not the shooting was an accident.
The scenario that was given to me was that Jeremy might have struck the side of the edge of the table and might have accidentally discharged the firearm.
The .357 was constructed with a hammer block, which is designed to prevent it from discharging if accidentally dropped or bumped. Though incriminating, that didn't prove that Jeremy had intentionally fired the weapon. Patel needed to determine how much force had to be applied to the trigger in order to fire the weapon.
What we do is take a set of weights and hang them from the trigger and keep adding on weight to the end of the trigger till it actually goes off, and that will tell us how much force was required for that particular fire.
Patel determined that 10 1/4 pounds of pressure was required to fire the .357 Magnum revolver. He concluded that an accidental flinch would not have been enough to cause the gun to fire. The analysis indicated that Jeremy Bach intentionally pulled the trigger. 13-year-old Jeremy Bach was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Authorities believe that Jeremy invited his friend Brad Hansen to his house and then confronted him about Brad and Jennifer's blossoming relationship. Driven by a jealous rage, Jeremy grabbed his stepfather's gun and shot Brad. tried as an adult in the state of Arizona, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Brad Henson's body has never been found. Sometimes, juveniles believe that homicide is the answer to their problems. When that happens, investigators and forensic scientists must focus on the facts, which can turn dreams of a promising future into the reality of a wasted youth.
Here she comes.
A quiet Washington State community becomes the backdrop to a string of brutal murders. And all of the evidence suggests that the serial killer is responsible. As investigators struggle to identify a suspect, more bodies continue to surface. In Michigan, the pregnant wife of a promising young attorney is found dead in the couple's home. Though it appears to be the result of a tragic accident, police are not convinced. It falls to forensic examiners to expose the truth. Solving a murder requires a team of experts whose efforts often go unrecognized. When crime fighters meet crime writers, their story is finally told. And many times, it's a tale stranger than fiction.
It's over. Ash Ladoon is dead.
This is a relief to hear. But Hashladun's presence is no coincidence.
Bellevue, Washington
The
lies
Hive
just
must
east of the
have
city of
grander
Seattle.
ambitions for the pyramid's influences. Return to me.
It's a
There is
thriving
much to
community of about
discuss.
100,000 people who live, work, and play here. But in the summer of 1990, young women began turning up dead throughout the city. On Saturday, June 23rd, Bellevue police received a 911 call. A restaurant employee had stumbled upon the lifeless body of a young woman. Investigators responded to the scene. They found the victim lying among trash next to a dumpster behind the restaurant. She was nude except for a necklace. Her arms and legs were positioned as if she were lying in a coffin. A pine cone rested in her hands. It was clear that the victim's body had been posed by the killer. Technicians managed to locate a single black hair near the woman. But they found no clues to her identity or that of her killer.
Time to snag another submine fragment,
Bellevue
Guardian.
detective Marvin
Get in
Steen
and out
was
before
assigned
they
the
even know what's
case.
hit 'em.
He knew this wasn't going to be an easy murder to solve.
Most crime scenes, you know who your victim is. In this particular crime scene, we had no idea at all who our victim was, her identification. We also lacked clothing, so we couldn't provide a clothing description when we asked the public for their assistance in determining who the victim was.
The medical examiner concluded that the woman, likely between the ages of 25 and 35, had died as a result of strangulation. She had also been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted. In addition to collecting biological evidence, dozens of fibers clinging to the victim's body were also recovered. Though it wasn't much to work with, detectives forwarded what little evidence they had to the Washington State Patrol crime lab in nearby Tacoma. After examining the fibers under a microscope, all that scientists could conclude was that they had originated from the carpet or trunk mat of a car. Next, the black hair collected from the crime scene was analyzed, in the hopes it would provide some clue to the killer's identity. Forensic scientist Terry McAdam.
You can look at it for predominantly pigmentation. Helps us to decide which possible broad racial groups it may belong to.
From the color, texture, and shape, McAdam determined that the hair had come from an African-American male. But having been found among trash and debris, its connection with the crime was uncertain. Investigators knew the best way to find this killer would be to first identify the victim. But no missing persons reports filed in the city of Bellevue matched their victims.
We went to the news media, who, of course, were interested in the case, asked for their assistance. We also went to teletypes and bulletins for surrounding law enforcement agencies, asking them to check for missing individuals in their cases.
Soon after, investigators got their first break. In a neighboring jurisdiction, a woman had reported her roommate missing. From photos taken at the autopsy, she identified the victim as her 27-year-old friend, Marianne Polway. She said that she had last seen Marianne 3 nights earlier when she prepared to go out for the evening. Marianne had borrowed her roommate's necklace. It was the same one found around the victim's neck. Marianne usually spent her Fridays at a bar 2 blocks from where her body was found.
The roommate indicated to us that Marianne's personality was one that was a free spirit, and that Marianne definitely enjoyed dancing, and that she would go to the various local clubs to dance. That was her main purpose as far as recreation. We learned that Marianne was a very hard worker. We learned that also from co-workers and from employers. The roommate indicated to us that Marianne would not go with a stranger, someone unknown to her.
Following up on the roommate's information, police went to the bar where Marianne spent her Friday nights. The restaurant manager knew her well, and she had been there the night before her body was discovered. Though he hadn't noticed who she was with, he believed she had left in a hurry. Marianne had forgotten her sweater and purse. Investigators collected the items, hopeful they contained some clue to her killer's identity. But the evidence failed to yield any useful information. The investigation into Marianne Polreich's murder was going nowhere. And the caseload for Bellevue detectives was about to increase. On August 9, 1990, police were dispatched to the home of Carol Beatty. Her ex-husband, Paul, had received a call from his 2 young children earlier that day. They said that their mom was locked inside her bedroom and wouldn't come out. When Paul came to the house, he discovered his 36-year-old ex-wife Carol dead inside her bedroom. It looked as though she had shot herself. When police entered the room, however, it became clear this was no suicide. Though a shotgun lay near the victim, it had not been fired. Instead, the killer had posed the victim's nude body and used the shotgun graphics as a prop. Carol Beatty had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death.
Battle song emboldens her soldiers.
But no biological evidence of rape was found. Technicians collected a few black hairs from the sheets. Though robbery did not appear to be a motive, family members later determined that Carol's heirloom ring was missing. For Bellevue homicide detective Dale Foote, the similarities between the Marianne Polreich and Carol Beatty murders had to be more than coincidental.
Bellevue is a pretty quiet suburban town, and we don't have a whole lot of homicides here, so we have two cases with women that are openly displayed and posed nude. Yeah, we're having some questions. Why are these two cases so similar in nature? Is there any connection between them? Do they know each other? Does their friends know each other? Did they work together? Did they attend some of these nightclubs together? We just didn't know. So some of those questions we had to answer, and answer real fast.
To find out if the cases were in fact connected, police forwarded the hairs recovered from the Carol Beatty crime scene to the lab. When examiners compared those to the one recovered from the Marianne Polreich crime scene, they concluded that the hairs had originated from the same person. Bellevue police were now faced with the possibility that a serial killer was loose in their city. Looking to find a common thread between the two victims, investigators began interviewing Carol Beatty's co-workers at a popular restaurant where she had worked as a waitress. Carol's friends could not imagine why anyone would have wanted to hurt her. Though she and her ex-husband Paul were divorced, they maintained a great relationship. And Carol's two daughters constantly showered her with love and affection. Though Carol Beatty would sometimes go to nightclubs, police were unable to establish any connection between her and Marianne Polreich. The two unsolved murder investigations quickly became front-page news.
Submine vault's locked down tight.
Soon,
The
the
maintenance
mystery
staffs
caught
are
the
just
attention
big
of
enough to
veteran
fit
crime
you and
writer
all that
Jack
armor.
Olson.
Happy crawling.
I never knew there was
With
a
10
submine
true
house
crime
in
novels
Europa.
to his credit, Olson recognized that as
Neither
a
did
writer,
the Vanguard's
this story
archives.
was too unusual to be ignored.
Which submine is this?
I have the same question.
I think the thing
Turns
that
out
made this
it's not
case
really a
unusual
submine. Not
was
the
exposing the bodies.
It's more like a foundational AI.
That is not
framework they all
seen.
use.
It is seen, but it's not seen very often. It represents some kind of a deep-seated hatred of man.
And Bellevue police feared that such a deep-seated hatred would not simply go away on its own. If they didn't identify a suspect in the killing, fast, it would only be a matter of time until more victims turned up dead. Police in Bellevue, Washington struggled to solve the sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of two young women. The bodies of 27-year-old Marianne Polreich and 36-year-old Carol Beatty were discovered less than 2 months apart. Having found both victims savagely beaten, sexually assaulted, and their bodies posed after death, investigators had reason to believe that the murders were the work of one predator. But so far, they had no idea who that was or when he would strike them next. On September 3rd, 1990, police in neighboring King County received a 911 call. The body of 24-year-old Randy Levine had been discovered by her landlady. She had been savagely beaten, and her nude body was posed suggestively in her bed. technicians located a single dark hair near the victim's body. The only item determined to be missing from the room was an antique ring. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that Randy Levine had died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head. Though she had also been sexually assaulted, no biological evidence was found. But the medical examiner did find evidence that the young woman had been tortured.
One big shrieky eye.
283
Guardian,
tiny
take
puncture
gouging.
wounds dotted her body. The pattern of some of the injuries suggested that the killer had played a game of tic-tac-toe. Because the Levine homicide happened outside the city limits of Bellevue, its parallels with the unsolved Holright and Beatty murders might have gone unnoticed. But then, Bellevue Police Detective Ed Mott received a call from a paramedic who happened to be called to all 3 crime scenes. And he couldn't help but notice the similarities.
He says, I'm not a cop, I'm not a policeman. He says, but the last 3 murder cases I've been to, he says, it's really odd that the 3 bodies have been posed.
Bellevue police also learned that Randy Levine had been to a Bellevue nightclub the night before she was found murdered. There could now be little doubt that a serial killer had claimed the lives of all 3 women. Officers from throughout the area began pooling their resources, desperate to identify this killer before he struck again. The senselessness of the homicide left veteran crime writer Jack Olson struggling for answers. He wondered why these women in particular had been targeted for murder. He could find no rational explanation.
And they were perfectly fine women doing exactly what we would expect decent young women of their age, 20, 30, 35, to be doing. They held jobs, they were responsible. Yes, they did go to nightclubs now and then. They're admirable people.
As the hunt for the serial killer intensified, an intelligence officer with the Seattle Police Department believed he had uncovered a possible lead. A few days after the Randy Levine homicide in King County, a man named George Waterfield Russell was arrested near her residence for impersonating a police officer. According to the reports, when 32-year-old Russell was pulled over for traffic violations, the officer saw him try to hide something under the vehicle. At first, Russell identified himself as an undercover police officer, but later recanted. Suspicious, the patrol officer searched his car.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's bad.
He located a
Name's
police
rubbed off
scanner,
most of the signs.
a buck knife,
Very humorous.
and 2
I gather
IDs.
the solar system is a war-torn ruin, despite all of you
Hidden underneath the
guardians.
vehicle, he found a loaded handgun.
You're the first critic to foretell my doom.
A check of the
Here
serial
I am.
numbers revealed that the gun had
Here
recently
you
been
are.
stolen. Russell was placed under arrest for impersonating an officer and being in the possession of a stolen weapon.
After the incident,
A records check showed that Russell had an extensive criminal record, which included sexual assaults and cat burglaries.
understand there's a couple
Mostly, George Russell stole jewelry.
police officer.
A further background check revealed that Russell was known to frequent Bellevue area nightclubs, and he had a reputation.
Brought him to my attention. And, just
Well, George was a charmer, and basically he was liked in the nightclubs. He was a popular man in the nightclubs. He had a good line of chatter. He would sidle over next to the DJ and they'd have a nice conversation, and then he'd sidle over to the bar and have a nice conversation with the bartender, and then various people, usually young women who came under his aura would sit with him, would buy him drinks. would tell him what a great guy he was.
Though that wasn't a crime, to investigators it went a long way in explaining how the 3 victims could have been manipulated into being alone with the killer. Detectives wanted to speak with George Russell about the murders.
Oh, I think
He claimed he didn't know anyone named Carol Beatty or Randy Levine. However, he admitted knowing Marianne Polwright.
We begin then.
In fact, he had seen her at a bar the night before she was found murdered. But he said they weren't there together and didn't speak. Recalling that fibers from a vehicle had been recovered from Polwright's body, police asked for permission to search his car. Russell claimed he had borrowed a friend's truck that night. Eager to cooperate, he gave police the address of his friend, who had lent him the vehicle.
Checking now.
The man confirmed he had lent Russell his truck several months earlier. He added that when Russell returned the vehicle the following day, there were large stains on the seats, and the interior of the car reeked from a horrible smell. It was so bad, he scrubbed the truck clean later that day. For investigators looking for proof that George Russell was a serial killer, that was the worst news they could hear. Investigators in Bellevue, Washington, believe that 32-year-old George Russell was responsible for a string of brutal sexual assaults and murders that had claimed the lives of 3 young women. Now they needed to prove it. Police located the vehicle Russell had borrowed the night that the first victim, Marianne Polwright, was killed, hopeful it contained evidence of murder. But in the days following the homicide, the truck had been thoroughly cleaned by its owner. But beneath the upholstery, technicians located a suspicious stain. It appeared to be blood. However, it was too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Fiber samples from the vehicle's carpet were also collected. At the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, examiners compared the fibers recovered from the truck to those collected from the body of Marianne Polwright. Though they were consistent with one another, supervising forensic scientist Terry McAdam knows that no analysis is perfect.
We can't say that that fiber came from that car, because unless we can take the exact fiber and match up its ends, we can't say that. What we can say is the fiber we found in a suspect's car matches that found on the clothing of the victim as regards to having similar microscopic characteristics. We can't say it's a match.
Still,